I'm very happy to welcome you to this event on protecting and supporting women human rights defenders in the Middle East and North Africa region. We understand that as meaning also our friends and colleagues from Iran and Afghanistan, and we will be listening to some personal accounts a bit later, and how protecting and supporting human rights defenders is a critical component in the efforts to end violence against women. So I'm joined with wonderful panelists. I'm Hasiba Hersahrawi. I'll be moderating this discussion really among friends and colleague activists. And I'll start maybe by introducing members of the panel. I'll start with you, Susan, because maybe I've known you the longest. Yeah. And so Susan Tamasebi is the director of MENA, the organization hosting this event. It's an organization which works to support women human rights defenders, their organizations and feminist movements in the Middle East and North Africa and in Asia, through advocacy, analysis of trends and research, convenings, and South-South collaborations. And I think this panel today is a great illustration of that. Susan is also a well-known women human rights defender from Iran. Between 1999 and 2010, you were based in Iran, and you really were part of an absolutely wonderful women's rights movement in Iran. For the past 11 years, however, you had to leave Iran, and you've been focusing on women's rights, peace and security in the whole region. Suzanne will give us an introduction about the kind of challenges that women human rights defenders in the Middle East and North Africa are facing, and some of the resources that they have developed, and the tricks that they have learned from each other in order to overcome what sometimes has been a ruthless repression by state authorities of women's activism. I'll then pass the floor to Raza Naim El-Maghrebi. I'm so pleased to have you with us today, Razan. Razan is a Libyan novelist and a short story author, so quite different. She works as an editor-in-chief for the cultural magazine Horizons, and has been writing for various Libyan newspapers since 1991. We also have a guest, and that's Razan's cat in the back. Her numerous short stories, novels, and poems deal with topics such as migration, exile, and feminism. Her novel, Women of Wind, published in 1911, was longlisted for the International Prize for Arabic Fiction, and she was awarded the Oxfam Novib Pen Award in 1915. Based on her own migration background and asylum experience, her work explores the situation of Libyan refugees in Europe. And we will see through our discussion today that unfortunately exile is something that many of our participants on this panel have had to experience, yet they continue their activism, but it's shaping them as well. Then it's my huge pleasure to introduce Shiva Nazarahari. I've known Shiva when she was a young activist in Iran, and so Shiva is an award-winning human rights activist, a blogger, a journalist, a women's rights activist, a founding member of the Committee of Human Rights Reporters. Since 2002, when she was 18, she's been in prison, she's been active, and she's been unfortunately in prison on several occasions for her peaceful protesting and reporting on human rights abuses in Iran. And last but not least, Zubayda Akbar will talk to us about the work of the Narrative of Violence campaign in Afghanistan. The campaign is focused on gathering and documenting the stories of survivors of gender-based violence for the purpose of raising awareness, empowering, and providing a platform. So we have this very diverse group But Susan will give us an overview first that will introduce us to the kind of challenges that women human rights defenders face in the region. And then we will see there are a lot of commonalities. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Hasiba. And so, yeah, so, obviously, I think globally we've seen pushback against civic space and against human rights defenders around the globe, but particularly in this region because we have a lot of authoritarian regimes and we've had a lot of conflict, a lot of transition. That pushback has been a little bit more severe or particularly severe. Women human rights defenders are critical actors in promoting and advocating for positive social changes, for ensuring rights of communities, but particularly of women. And after the revolutions of the Arab world and the uprisings, which are still continuing, obviously, they're continuing in places like Lebanon and Iraq and other places. We saw either we have a couple of examples where things have gone pretty well, but in most of the region, we've seen either conflict that's emerged, like in Libya or Syria, um, or we've seen serious repression in places like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, even more recently in the last, not 10 years, but the last 5 or 6 years in places like Turkey, also in Egypt that initially had a successful, what seemed like a successful revolution, but now we have serious repression. And unfortunately, that repression is very much targeted against human rights defenders, their organizations, their NGOs, movements, and particularly women. And it's difficult for the women human rights defenders because they're already working in a difficult situation, advocating for changes that perhaps might not get the same level of community support. They're also, like the women that they're advocating for, they may be facing violence, gender-based violence, sexual violence in their work or even in the home. So they're dealing with all the stereotypical or the discriminatory laws and practices of the communities that they're advocating for, but here they are, they're advocating for rights. And they're also then facing repression from state security. And in some contexts, as you'll see in the case of Afghanistan and in the case of Libya and other places, they're also facing not only state pressure, but pressure from extremist groups, non-state actors. There's been a pushback on the ability of organizations to be functional. NGO laws have been adopted to greatly restrict the activities of the NGO sector. And we saw before the revolution, for many years, Egypt had a very vibrant civil society, very vibrant NGO sector, and they did incredible work in terms of pushing for rights and guarantees for women, particularly in the constitution, the second constitution after the Egyptian revolution. They had 2 constitutions. So they ensured several provisions in the constitution. So they've had many successes, but now there's great pushback against women civil society organizations, and women human rights defenders are also being judicially harassed. And it's the same across the region. So you see governments that are adopting smear campaigns against human rights defenders, then they're charging them with crimes. Oftentimes the crimes that women human rights defenders are being charged with are either national security crimes or terrorism charges, simply for defending human rights. So we see that in Egypt with a number of women's groups, individual women human rights defenders, journalists. And then we also see similar cases in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia, after years of women advocating for rights, has decided to adopt certain rights that women have advocated for. For example, giving women the right to drive. But unfortunately, as it does that, it's also imprisoned those very same women who advocated for these changes, like Loujain al-Hathloul, who was recently released, but she's not free. She's still facing court. She's still facing terrorism charges, and others like Samar Badawi continue to remain in prison. We have similar issues, similar cases in Turkey, for example, where women, for speaking up, they're charged with supporting terrorist groups. you know, like Shabnam Finjanchi. She's a longtime women human rights defender who's facing charges, terrorism charges. And so we see this trend across the region, but unfortunately in some contexts also, we see that women human rights defenders are being targeted for assassinations and killings. I won't talk, of course, I won't talk about Iran. In Iran, we have a number of women rights defenders in prison, and Shiva will talk about that a lot more. But in other contexts, especially well, if they're in a conflict context, their lives are in danger anyway. But in many of these contexts, they're being targeted for assassination. For example, in Iraq and Libya, and then in Afghanistan. So the situation is pretty dire. I'll mention 2 points and then I'll let you go on to ask others questions so that we can hear very specific examples of what's going on. So what's happened as civil society space has closed down, as a lot of activists, not just women activists, but a lot of other human rights defenders have moved to online spaces. But those online spaces have now been criminalized by governments as well. And so women are being smeared. Women human rights defenders, all human rights defenders, but women human rights defenders are also being smeared in these spaces. And a lot of times they're being smeared in very creative ways. So they're being targeted for sexual types of smears. And this is extremely problematic because then it turns their family against them. They don't have the same support that they should have from their families, but they're also being, you know, treated as criminals for whatever activities they're doing online. If they're speaking online, criticizing, or if they're doing education or for simple tweets. So this is extremely problematic. Yeah, so this is sort of they're being targeted online, and then also many are being targeted in real life for assassinations and for killings. It hasn't stopped, I should say, I don't want to make it sound so depressing because it hasn't stopped women activists from doing the work that they're doing. They're still continuing to do the work that they're doing. They're still advocating for rights, despite the fact that they face many, many dangers. But we really want to hold governments accountable so that they facilitate, in accordance with many of their own national laws, but international laws as well. They facilitate the work of women human rights defenders and human rights defenders in general. And we want to bring the attention of the UN and the international women's movement to the particular issues that women human rights defenders are facing in this region and ask them to stand in solidarity with them and support them. So I'll stop there so that you can give others a chance to provide more specific examples, and then you can ask me questions, more general questions as well.
That's great, Susan, and you really put your fingers on it. It's this mix of patriarchy and cultural and religious beliefs, ideas on masculinity, militarism, fundamentalism that are going to shape the experience of women human rights defenders in the region and the situation of women in general. You've mentioned assassinations, and unfortunately, we will hear about that from Azan about Libya. We will hear from it also from Zubaydah in Afghanistan. But Razan, I'm going to start by challenging you, asking, well, maybe showing the contradiction of Libya as an example, maybe for the whole region, because just this week we've had a new government being sworn in. We've had, so Libya has for the first time a woman Minister of Foreign Affairs. We have 5 women who have now appointed ministers, who have a woman Minister of Justice. Still, these 5 women were still below the 30% that were pledged by the Prime Minister designate. So there was this idea of having 30% of women, but yet we got 5 women ministers. But also not so long ago in November, we had a prominent women human rights defender, Hanan al-Barasi, being gunned down really in the middle of the street of Benghazi in bright daylight. So what does it tell us about Libya?
أولا
First of all, I'm happy to be with you.
شكرا حسيبة شكرا
Thank you, Hasiba. Thank you,
الوضع
Susan.
في ليبيا سنبدأ
The
من سؤال
situation in Libya, we
حسيبة
will start with Hasiba's
وهو
question.
ما توصلنا إليه أخيرا في
What
الأيام
we have reached
القليلة
recently
الماضية
in the past few
وهي
days,
حكومة
which is the
وطنية
presence of a national
تريد أن
government,
تضم
a unified national government that wants
البلاد
to
لتكون
bridge the any gap to have the country under one
7 سنوات
uh, government after it has been split for 6 or 7 years. Until now, we are very
نجح هذه
optimistic
الحكومة
for this government to be
هناك تحديات
successful.
كثيرة طبعا
There are many challenges, of course. With
لماذا
relation to your question, let's start
وجودنا
with the presence of the
للحكومة
female ministers in the
بالتأكيد
government.
أمر مفرح جدا
Truly,
خصوصا
this is
أن
something to be
تأتي
very happy
مناصب
about,
سيادية وذات
particularly in
أساسية
sovereign positions, Ministry of Foreign
وهذا
Affairs, Ministry of Justice,
هذا
Ministry
لا
of
يعني
Women's Affairs.
أن
But this does not
المرأة
mean that
أصبحت
women
متمكنة
have
وفي
now become
حماية
empowered and
من
protected
حماية أو أمنية
on the
تضمن
level of the community or the
مستلزمات كثيرة
security that
اليوم الحكومة
guarantee
نفسها
their lives.
تحتاج
Even the government
إلى
itself
تقنيات
now
من
needs
نوعها
security protection of a
خاصة
certain type
تماسك
in the
الأمنية
light
ما زال
of the
غير
security breaches.
متوفر بشكل
Security
كامل
is
عبر
not
وزارة الخارجية يعني
regulated
في الشرق وفي
properly
الغرب
under the system of the
تتجمع
Ministry of
كما ذكرت
Interior in the
قوات
east and in the
الرئيس
west.
المرتضى
In the east,
حفتر
the Haftar related
قامت بقتل
um,
حنان البرصي
forces
لأنها
killed Hanan
قامت
al-Barasi because she
هذه القتال
criticized
في وضح
them.
الظاهر وأمام الجميع
She was killed in
وأثبتت
broad daylight in
أننا
front of
كلنا
anyone.
نتابعها
We all
عبر
followed
التلفزيونات
live
تقف
her assassination,
وهي
and
أيضا تعمل حقوقية وتعمل
she
مدافعة
is
عن
also
حقوق
a
الإنسان
rights defender and
لكن
activist.
بدورنا طالبنا
In
بكشف
turn, we
مقتلها
demanded
وقتلها
to
ولكن
find out,
لا
to
توجد أي
disclose who
نتائج
killed her.
يعني
However, there are no
الحكومة
results
إذن
in
نكون
reality.
صريحين في الشرق البلاد ما زالت
In the
تحكمه
east, it is still
العسكرية
governed by military.
في غرب البلاد كانت
In the west,
الميليشيات هي
the
المسيطرة والمحتكرة
militias were in control, and they still
تتمكن
are.
فقط بعد
Today,
تفاوض
we are
وطنية
only
تكون الاجتماعات
optimistic
خمسة زائد
that the
خمسة
meetings in CERT
لتحقيق
5 plus 5
المهدف
is to
العسكري
unify
بحيث
the military
نخرج
organization
من هذه
in order to
الأحزاب
get rid of
التي
these
تشتغل لمصالحها
entities
الشخصية
that work or
والتي هي
operate for their
مسؤولة
own
عن كثير من جرائم
personal
القتل
interests and
وانتهاك
who
حقوق
are
الإنسان
responsible for many of the
أزمة الحرب
violations and
الأخيرة
crimes against human rights. We do not forget the
كانت
recent war
قوات الشرق
where
في
the
وضع عمليات
East
ضد
forces led by Haftar
طرابلس العدوان على
against
طرابلس
Tripoli, the
وتمت
assault against Tripoli,
الكثير
which
من
left
الجرائم والانتهاكات
many of the violations and
المتمثلة في
crimes
إبادة
against
جماعيات في
human
ترهونة
rights,
في
mass
ترهونة
graves in
5
Terhuna.
نساء من عائلة واحدة
5 women from
اغتلنا
one
في
family were
يعني
killed in Terhuna.
اختطاف النساء
The
سرقة
women were
الآباء
abducted,
واغتلنا
families were abducted and
هذه
killed.
الجرائم طالبت
These
الحكومة في الغرب
crimes, the
بالخروج
government in the West
باستئناف
demanded the
التحقيقية
UN
وهي ما زالت
to send a
إجراءات
delegation to
محلية
investigate,
أريد أن
and
أذكر
it is ongoing.
النساء والمدافعات
Women
في
and
ليبيا من
human rights
بداية
defenders in
الانتصارات
Libya from the
الجيش
beginning, we
القتل
have
وليس
faced
أول حادث
extreme
تم في
violence and
سلوى
killing. We do not forget the first killing
فقط
of Salwa
الانتخابات
Bukaikis in
الأخيرة
Benghazi during
2014
the recent
والحقيقة
events in 2014.
ولأنني كنت مهددة
Because I was
بالإنسحاب
threatened,
فعليا قاموا بإجراءات ضدي
they
شخصيا
took measures against me in person. My
بعدها بيوم
son was
توفت بنتي
kidnapped
قبلها
a day
بأيام
later. There was an
بالضبط
attempt to kidnap
كيف
my daughter.
تلك
Before
الأيام
that, I was
الصعبة
shot
كيف
at. I remember these difficult
ساعدتني
days,
المنظمات
how
ولكن اسمع
organizations
سوزان
helped me. I
كانت وحيدة
really have to
لأنني كنت في
thank
وضع
Susan. I
صعب
am almost in tears because I
كان
was really
صعب جدا
in a very
لأنها مرحلة
difficult
مرحلة
situation. I'm
وأريد
on now talking about
أن
my personal
أشوف التفاصيل
situation.
لأنها
I do
صعبة
not want to talk
وأعرف
too much about my situation because it was very difficult. I know what women do, the human rights defenders, how they, in the international organizations, how they saved lives. Thank you, Susan. Thanks to you and all those who helped me and saved my life. Hasiba knows the campaign against my sister Layla because of a book and how the imam in the mosque calls her infidel. The video on YouTube, I cannot watch it, where he says, kill her, and how she ran away with her family. Now she is in France, safe. She is a defender also, and she is in an enlightenment movement. Before that, they killed Intisar, who was her colleague in Tripoli. There are assassination crimes, whether in the West or in the East, against women, human rights defenders, and all due to the fundamentalist Islamist movements in the West. And now we see defenders, female defenders being killed due to the military rule in the East. This is something that we cannot hide now. I hope that I didn't take too long.
Thank you so much, Razan, for sharing your experience with us. And we will see that this is unfortunately not unique, and it's an experience that is shared with some of the women in this panel. I think you've said a few things that resonate with me. It's like the threats were not only against you, but they were against your children. And the threats were also online. And that's something that we see. There's the Libyan organization, Lawyers for Justice in Libya, has just released this tremendous report on online violence against women, and the level of attacks is astounding, and it poses the question as well of that shrinking space for women. Women are not physically able to be outside and be activists. They had that online space, and that is now being very unsafe, proving very unsafe for them. So this is something that maybe we can talk about a bit later. You've mentioned the women activists being killed. Some have disappeared as well, and we still having no news of member of parliament, Hiram Sirgawa, in Libya. But that takes me, I think, to Afghanistan. That takes me to Afghanistan because we see here some similarities. Just at the beginning of the month, we had another 3 women journalists being gunned down in the street again. And that was the latest in, unfortunately, a very long list of assassination of women activists. The price paid by women in Afghanistan seems to be humongous. Yet, you're here with us today talking to us about a campaign that Afghanistan women are leading, and also explaining to us what the demands of women in Afghanistan are. Over to you, Zubaydah.
Thank you so much, Hasiba, and thank you for having me on this panel with these amazing 2 women and their heartbreaking stories. The situation in Afghanistan is similar in many ways because we are in the process of going through peace talks with the Taliban. And in this process, we have been observing that the voices of the Afghan women, the red lines of the Afghan women, the demands of the Afghan women have been undermined not only by the Taliban, but by the different sides of the negotiations that are negotiation tables that are currently ongoing. And another negative outcome of this peace talks that are ongoing, is that increased attacks on civilians, but also increased attacks on any voice of progress in Afghanistan by the Taliban, because they are coming into this peace negotiations from a place of power backed by the United States. The peace talks originally started with the interference of the United States government. We think that this is a peace negotiation process, a peace talk of the U.S. government with the Taliban, disregarding the Afghan government and the Afghan people. As you rightly mentioned, Hasiba, 3 women were killed earlier in March. Female judges were attacked in January. 3 other women were killed in an attack in Afghanistan last week. And these number of targeted killings have increased since start of the peace negotiations and peace talks. Since 2018, we have had 65 media and human rights workers killed in Afghanistan. So all in all, I think as we are reaching towards an end of these peace talks, and the U.S. has shared an agreement that they have come up with the Taliban, and we see an increase in targeted attacks of women, human rights activists, any voice for progress of Afghanistan, we see a risk of being eliminated again. We see a risk of being confined again. As a result of this peace process that was not inclusive, that was not representative, that did not include the voices of women, the voices of victims of war, the voices of the people of Afghanistan.
I'm hearing you, and I'm also thinking, Razan, how does that resonate with you? Because you're saying victims, Zubaida, you said victims of the war were not on the table. And that takes me, Razan, to a question about what transitional justice for Libya to come. And are there lessons that you should learn from the experience of women human rights defenders in Afghanistan?
In reality, it was more than a war and a conflict. The last war was the most difficult. It continued for 1.5 years, left behind many victims in a very crowded capital, where there were people who lost their homes, there were people who were killed, even the civilians were killed due to the bombings. What happened now is that there is a social gap between the East and the West. Before we talk about transitional justice, it seems that we need restorative justice. It's very important as the first step, because at least restorative justice is the step that the Libyan community needs to start, maybe under international support. It is the case now in Libya to have one government. This second step comes the transitional justice. However, as we see, there are signs that there will be impunity in Libya, meaning that the government that left power 2 days ago put militia members in positions of security and political positions. They are part of the structure of the Libyan administration in high positions, and this is impunity. How can we achieve transitional justice in Libya? In my opinion, first is to investigate all the crimes. And I remember, Hasiba, you reminded me of the parliament member, the female parliament member, Siham Sergeeva. The parliament met, the new government was sworn in. Before it did not mention anything about the member that disappeared. Most news say that she was killed as a result of raising her voice, calling for peace. She refused the war against Tripoli. This is all that the parliamentarian said. She said no to the war against Tripoli. So she was taken out. Thus, before investigating coercive disappearances of women, men, and defenders of human rights. This we need a constitution, and this constitution will not take place before the coming elections, that we are hoping that the new government, the transitional government, to be the last transitional period in Libya, to elect the presidency, the new members, to draft a real constitution. The major challenge is the constitution, because the constitution that was drafted and that we were not asked about, there were Islamist groups that interfered with it. This is another problem that faces us. We need a government and a law of political parties that prohibits fundamentalist religious groups to have political parties through which they can come into political life. These are all challenges that we face now. Therefore, your question is difficult. It's very important, I know. How can we have transitional justice before the constitution, the laws, and the elections?
Zubaida, I want to go back to you. With all the experience of Afghan women, and I think the shared experience of here of women being women's rights issue always going on the back burner. It's not time. The priority is peace. We'll get to it later. This is not the time. What are the pitfalls that women human rights activists in Libya should avoid based on the experience on Afghan women?
Well, the peace. There were many obstacles towards meaningful participation of Afghan women in the peace negotiations when they started back in September. The biggest problem was that the talks and the idea around peace negotiations came from the United States. And at the initial stages, they didn't involve Afghan women. They didn't even involve the Afghan government. We felt like we were being placed in a position where we have to react to a situation. And that automatically put us in a place where we had very little say. So we had to find our way around the table that was already decided, around the table that they already know what the agenda is going to be, who the participants are going to be, and what the talks are going to be. And additionally, for the Afghan people, for me as an Afghan woman, the Taliban, we always consider them a terrorist group, a criminal group who have continued to kill the Afghan people, who have continued to cause atrocities across Afghanistan, attack women, attack women's rights, girls' educations. We have a long list of the number of schools that the Taliban have continued to burn down, the number of girls that they have poisoned for going to school. They still practice in areas where that's under their control. They still continue to practice barbaric practices such as stoning of women for using their basic rights, for raising their voice, for just being women. So for us, we believed, Afghans believed, that a peace negotiation cannot start without the accountability of Taliban for the atrocities they have caused, without them taking responsibility for what they have done, without a transitional justice happening, people being held accountable for what they did. And that step was bypassed when these peace negotiations led by the United States started. They brought the Taliban around the table with some of our representatives as an equal partner in these negotiations. And that was not the right starting point for us. We had a lot to clarify with the Taliban before we started to negotiate with them. And we didn't get that chance. And we think at that stage, our voices were suppressed. In the initial talks, we never had, and this has continued to be the same. We did not have any representatives of the families of the war victims. And I think these are the people who decide the conditions of a peace negotiation with the Taliban. We did not have meaningful participation of women around the negotiation table. And the war of the Taliban against women has been a long war. During their regime, they lashed women, they suppressed women, they killed women, they stoned women, and they were against any public appearance of women in public. A woman could not go outside of the house without a male company. And sometimes that male company could be their 6-year-old son. A 6-year-old son could validate the presence of a woman outside. So there is a lot of red lines, there is a lot of stories, there is a lot of issues that we first need to tackle with the Taliban. And even during the process, while we continue to fight for our space around the negotiating table, we continue to raise our voice about our rights. We continue to also message about what we wanted from these peace negotiations. And the reaction of the Taliban, what we have heard from them, shows that they have not changed, that they still believe in those barbaric practices. They still have a definition of what the women's rights should be under a certain Islamic government that they are thinking about bringing back to Afghanistan. And currently, as we speak right now, they are preparing for another peace talk in Moscow tomorrow, where our government is going to be sitting across the table with them to discuss the peace process. And in this delegation of that, so we are in a place where we have undermined by both sides, both the Afghan government, but also the Taliban, and also our international partners, the world. We feel like that the world has left us alone, have betrayed Afghan women in this process. In this peace talk tomorrow, in the Afghan delegation, there is one woman in a delegation of 16 men, I think. And there are 0 representatives of the families of the war victims. Throughout this process, Afghan women have continued to use all the platforms that they have to talk about their demands, to ask about to share their asks from this process. We have fought this war in many fronts. We want our place in the negotiation, people. We want our red lines to be listened to. We want our voices to be listened to. We want to have a meaningful participation in this process. And in all of those fronts, we have not been able to find our space. We have not been able to find our peace. Right now, we are in a place where the US government has shared an agreement that they have come up with the Taliban. We don't know the mechanism through which this agreement was developed. This agreement includes points that we think are questionable, that we think are dangerous, that we think will undermine our constitution, and that we think will bring the Afghan people years back. All of our progress is at stake if this agreement of the US and the Taliban is implemented. This progress includes human rights, free speech, our right to education, our right to employment, our right to political participation. They are taking us back 16 years. And all of this happened while we continued to ask for our space at the negotiation table. We continued to raise our voice about what we wanted, and all of that was disregarded. And in this space, the Taliban, the terrorist group who is responsible for killing hundreds of Afghans, had a stronger support, a stronger back, a stronger platform, a stronger place in this negotiation process. They were able to have their conditions included in this agreement, but we don't see ourselves anywhere in this agreement. So I think in terms of what lessons can be learned for us, I think this was a process that was imposed, and we had to fight our way into it. We had to make sure that somewhere someone listens to our voice. A negotiation, a peace process with a terrorist group responsible for killing Afghans cannot be initiated without the voices of Afghans, cannot be initiated without including Afghans, without participation of Afghans, without presence of Afghans, and that presence did not exist from the beginning. We feel like that the US decided to invade Afghanistan 16 years ago. They fought this long fight with the Taliban over 16 years. They made many mistakes. The reason why the Taliban came back stronger was as a result of these mistakes. And then 16 years later, they decided that they were tired, they were done with Afghanistan, and they did care less, and they are now handing over the country to a terrorist group. That is what the situation looks like to us, Afghans, who are suffering every day, who are dying every day. Every single day we wake up to a terrorist attack that has taken the lives of our friends, our families, our colleagues. This is what it looks like, what's happening, that we are being handed over.
Thank you for that impassionate speech, Zubaida. And I think you've talked about the role of the United States, you've talked about the role of the international community, and I just want to turn to Shiva for a moment. When we hear about Iran in international media, it's either about the nuclear file, about sanction against Iran, or and how do women in Iran navigate this international context to be able to push the struggle for women's rights? I was like, let's remember that in December, there was a draft law tabled in parliament on violence against women. So things are happening. How do you navigate this, and how can Iranian women activists, faced with an economic crisis, faced with COVID, are able to continue their activism?
Thank you, Hasiba. Thank you for having me in this panel. So I think and the women's movement in Iran is at a very critical juncture. The Iranian government has shown regrettable records when it comes to women's rights. In the past 4 decades, the government has shown no tolerance for civic and advocacy efforts to improve women's rights. Demanding equal rights for women is considered a very sensitive topic. The government has made every effort to force women into subordinate positions, reduce the impacts of their grassroots movement, and normalize their inferiority as a status quo. The government's patriarchal narrative that appeals to religion and traditions denies women's rights and portrays WHRDs as troublemaking Western agents. While the rights of women are systematically violated, WHRDs are being pushed to the margin of society and increasingly face long-term prison sentences and targeted harassment. Women activists in Iran have always been working under very difficult situation. And as you mentioned, they've been facing with economic crisis due to sanction and pandemic in recent years. I see most of their work are online now, but they have also some activities on the ground, like they try to make conversation with people about sexual assault and raise their awareness, holding workshop on creating a work environment without harassment and violence. They talk more and more about discrimination in law, write about it, and use social media to influence on more people. But right now, the sanction was very difficult for people in Iran, and also was for civil society. Women rights movement is so isolated right now, but also in this situation, in last 6 months, the Me Too movement started in Iran, and I would like to mention this powerful movement, although all the security issues in Iran. In recent months, Iranian women's rights advocates have been at the forefront of the critical Me Too movement. They have stood with harassed women who came forward with their experiences of sexual abuse on social media, despite all the security pressure and risk. They support them and demand rules which can protect women against violence. in such a traditional and patriarchal society, they've been under pressure from both security services and society. But they continue to show support for these women, publicize their stories, and provide them with legal advice and other forms of support. If I compare women's movement in Iran with like 10 years ago, I can say 10 years ago, women movement was focused on changing laws, but the young generation of women's movement now are more focusing on body, and they are following this topic, which is a real issue and very important things in Iran right now.
Shiva, we know, and your personal experience shows that Iranian women human rights defenders have paid and continue to pay a very high price for their activism. Can you tell us more about women activists who are currently in jail? Tell us more about the kind of tools that the authorities are using to crack down on women's activism.
The repression and harassment against women's rights activists and groups are often carried out in various ways. And women's gender is also used as a factor to put more pressure on them, and their sexuality is even targeted. Imprisonment, repeated interrogation, threats and intimidation, travel bans, bans on social media presence are among these methods. At the moment, there are around 50 women political prisoners in Iran that we know their names, and most of them are WHRDs. Probably there are others that we don't know of. In the past year, several women human rights defenders have been imprisoned or sentenced to prison. Some of them just for their efforts on women's rights and others for defending human rights. To name a few, Hoda Amid is sentenced to 8 years in prison, Najm Wahedi sentenced to 7 years in prison, Raha Askarizadeh sentenced to 2 years in prison, journalist and photographer Aliye Motallebzadeh is currently spending 3 years sentence in Evin prison. Sepide Qolian is sentenced to 5 years in prison and recently transferred to a prison with a very poor condition in Bushehr. And also 2 days ago, Saba Kordafshari's family announced that she was infected by COVID in Qarchak prison. She is only 20 years old and one of the youngest political prisoners in Iran. She is sentenced to 7.5 years in prison for protesting against compulsory hijab. What is happening now, and I insist on mentioning it, is that the security services are trying to break up the women's political ward in Evin. They are trying to send these women to different prisons in Iran from north to south. In the past several months, several women political prisoners were transferred to other prisons because when they are together, collective resistance is formed. Together, they are much stronger and they know it. So that's why they try to separate them and make them live among criminal prisoners, which is more difficult for them.
You've mentioned that one of the activists is currently jailed for fighting the compulsory hijab. What are the charges that are usually used against women activists?
Most of the time, I have to mention it, it's not just about Saba Kordafshari. I think right now there are maybe 5 or 6 women are in prison because of their protesting against compulsory hijab. and Islamic Republic charged them with different kind of subject, you know, like they protest against, because hijab is our rules. So they are protesting against laws and something like that, some charge like that. And Sabah Kordafshari at first sentenced to 15 years in prison, and now recently her charges reduced, and now she has to stay in prison for 7.5 years.
Susan, let me turn to you because you work on a regional level. Do we see the same kind of tactics used by government and non-state actors to target women activists in the region?
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, there are different levels of violence that are used against women human rights defenders, but one interesting thing, and I think one trend that we see across the region, and Shiva pointed it out, and I think we heard it also echoed in the discussions of Zobeida and Razan, is that as women human rights defenders are, you know, either harassed or limited in their activities or targeted and attacked, there is this concerted effort to push back women's gains. So we see that across the region. So whether it's governments or whether it's extremist groups, that's what they're doing. We see it, you know, in Egypt, for example, as there's all this pressure on women's NGOs. Recently, a law was introduced to limit to turn back some of the women's rights and limit their gains. We see it in Turkey, for example, that women human rights defenders are targeted for, you know, whether they speak up for peace or for rights or, you know, any sort of criticism that they might have of the government or even cultural beliefs when it comes to women. And, you know, in Turkey, I think is significant because we have a high rate of killing of women for honor crimes, etc. It's a pandemic. They've been talking about this for years now. And it's just the numbers of women that, you know, that are being killed in Turkey is just unbelievable. And I think people have probably seen some campaigns by Turkish women's movement. But, you know, as the numbers of women getting killed are on the rise and women are saying this is another form of pandemic, the government's not doing very much. It's also curtailing women human rights defenders, but then it's also pulling out of the Istanbul Convention. Turkey was always ahead of the region because it had adopted laws that would support women's rights, but also prevent violence against women. But this is now in the midst of all of this violence against women, the government is pulling out of its obligations to protect women from violence. And so we see similar things across the region. In Afghanistan, for example, this is part of what women have been saying all along, this level of killing of civilians and women is in fact intended to push back the gain so that people say that's enough. Okay, we just want peace. We don't want any rights. Or that, you know, when the Taliban take power, there's no sort of resistance to the pushback of rights. And we see similar things in Libya. I should say, you didn't mention this, and I think Razan is you know, she's very modest, but she organized the first probably ever of women's conference in Libya that talked about women's participation in the political process. And it was amazing. It was such a hopeful time. And I went there and you could really see that, you know, that Libya was emerging from this incredible period of isolation because of sanctions and, you know, similar. And I really related to the Libyans because I thought they were similar to the Iranians, that they wanted people to come and say, you know, we're not as bad as you think we are, as you hear about us in the international community and news. And there was an incredible hopeful time, but the pushback and the targeting of women human rights defenders in these countries has happened a lot of it by extremist religious groups, but the governments, people in charge, they don't care. It's done with impunity. And I really think that in many of these countries, there is this tacit sort of agreement between governments and extremist groups that, you know, this is an area that the governments are not going to enter, so to keep the extremist groups at bay in some way, that they have an understanding. And we see a lot of this across the region, I think, after the Arab revolutions. And we also have, after the Arab revolutions, we also have groups, you know, countries that came together in a coalition to fight extremists. But many of the policies of these countries are also very similar to the extremists, especially when it comes to women. And it's problematic. And some of the things that I hear now, especially with Afghanistan, is astounding to me. That and I'd like Zobeida also, maybe she can talk about this. So now that's a part of the peace process, there's a suggestion of establishing a fiqh council, a fiqh shura, or a jurisprudence council. Well, they're already within the constitution and the laws. There are all these other bodies that sort of make sure that the law is in line with Islam. So what is this supposed to mean? And why is the US involved in a process to implement without meaningful input from the Afghan people to say, okay, we're going to have this council that basically the Taliban is going to get to decide what's inside, what's in line with religion. And really, it's whose religion, whose definition of religion. One of the reasons why we established MENA was because after these revolutions and the coming to power of some of the Islamist groups, election processes, and the rise in extremism, was that the international community really began to court a lot of these religious groups. And I'm not saying some of the religious groups are doing excellent work, they're doing reinterpretation work, and they're doing it from a human rights perspective, but many of them are not. And I think the international community sees the rise of extremists as a religious issue. It's not a religious issue, it's a political issue. And, you know, partnering with all these groups that we don't really know, or we do know, they don't take a good position when it comes to rights, not just women's rights, to all rights, so that you can have peace, doesn't guarantee peace for people on the ground. And that's a problem, because if you don't have rights, if women are getting killed, or denied, you know, denied to leave their house or denied education, that's no peace. And we wanted to really recenter the voice of more progressive movements in the region, because they are there, they have been there, they were involved in these uprisings, and they continue to articulate very progressive demands. And they represent, in my belief, the majority of the people in this region, especially the young people. And if nothing else, they represent the future, and their voice needs to be elevated. I'll stop there, and you can ask, you know, Zobeida maybe to talk about that shura, the fiqh council, which has Afghan women up in arms again.
Zubaida, do you want to tell us more about it and the position of Afghan women in response to such a proposal?
Well, this is included in the agreement that the US and the Taliban came up with, and it is nothing that we did not expect, but because but we also are aware of the interpretation, how we know how the Taliban interpret religion, and how we know how dangerous that is, and we have lived the impact of it during the Taliban regime. So for many Afghans, it's something that we have not endorsed the agreement at all, because we don't know the mechanism through which this was developed. And before even talking about the implementation of this agreement, which the High Council of FIT is a part of it, our question is, how did you come up with this Please let us know what was the process through which this agreement was created. Who was involved in writing this agreement? Were there women's representatives? Were there the representatives of the Afghan people, or was it an agreement that the Taliban and the United States came up with each other? Because it does not speak for where the Afghan people are now. It does not speak for our gains. It does not speak for the rights of Afghan women. It does not speak for what we envision Afghanistan to be, considering all the sacrifices and all the loss we made in the past 16 years. 16 years ago, when the Taliban were ruling Afghanistan, Afghanistan was a different country. Now, the young people, the women of Afghanistan, we want progress, and we want to continue building on what we have gained so far. And this agreement does not look like something that would put us in a place where we would move forward. It puts us in a place where we have to go back now. We have to allow the Taliban to explain to us what our religion is, how they interpret it, and how it's going to be implemented. We feel like that in the presence of this high fiqh council, we will become a government of religious leaders, of mullahs, basically, something maybe similar to what's going on in Iran, but with the Sunni sect of mullahs, religious leaders running the country. And that we don't see that is going to be representative of our values. We think if this agreement, I am not talking about it as if it's going to be implemented, because I don't want to endorse it. I don't want to accept it. I don't agree with it. I don't think it should be something that we even think about implementing, because we were not involved in the process of it being developed, and there is a lot in it that we don't agree with. But if that was to be implemented, that would bring Afghanistan back many years back. And it would certainly suppress not only the voices of women, anyone who is about the progress of Afghanistan, anyone who wants to see Afghanistan in a better place. And when the negotiations started, and when all of this was so one-sided, we expected this. We know that the Taliban have not changed. We know that they're a terrorist group. We know that they're an extremist group. We know what their beliefs are. So them saying that they want a high council of fiqh is not something we didn't expect from them, but we were scared that this would happen. And now we will resist it. We will not be okay with this being implemented, and we want to question the United States as to why they were okay with this. Why is it that they think after 16 years of Afghans sacrificing, Afghans dying every day to bring Afghanistan where it is now, where we have some level of human rights, some level of free speech, some level of access to education for girls, there is some basic level of women's political and social participation. Why are you thinking that bringing back an entirely religious government is going to preserve everything that we have gained and move us forward? We don't see any moving forward in that. And we think it's very dangerous. We think it's very backwards. We think it's not okay. It's not acceptable.
I'm going to ask you a question immediately, and then I'd like to extend that question to all our panelists. It takes us to the role of the international community. So what do you expect, Zubaida, of the international community if they want to support women human rights defenders, and also to push for the respect of women's rights?
Well, my message to...
And I hope that others will be able to join in as well.
We want the world to know that Afghans want peace, and Afghans want to be an independent nation, and Afghans want a day where they are not dependent on international aid. That is the dream of every Afghan. We want to move towards that. We want to become that. But we also know that to get there, we can't do it alone. It is not possible to do it alone, especially the way we are grateful for the international contribution to Afghanistan for the past 16 years, but it's hard not to acknowledge the mistakes that were made that also brought us here to a place where we now have to start figuring it out with the Taliban, and that we have to negotiate and bow down to conditions of a terrorist group. And in a place and my second point would be, the Afghans are not against negotiating with the Taliban if it brings dignified peace, if it brings peace that comes along with justice for the Afghans who have sacrificed. Currently, we think the Taliban are negotiating from a place of power. We think that the Taliban know they are backed by the US. That's why they are bringing up this High Council of Fiqh. And they are thinking about bringing back their very strict religious interpretations and coming back to power with a very religious government. And there are very serious asks and demands that we have from the world. First of all, since the initiation of the peace process, the Taliban have stopped killing US military in Afghanistan, but they have not stopped killing the Afghan people. They have increased killing of civilians. This needs to end. If this is a peace with the Afghan people, then please stop killing the Afghan people. They agreed to a conditional ceasefire. Their prisoners were released by the Afghan government. Those prisoners went back to the war fields and started killing Afghans. So we need the world to stand with us when we say there needs to be an end to violence. The world needs to help us ensure that the US withdrawal from Afghanistan is going to be done responsibly, that it's not rushed, that it's calculated, and that it's not going to hand over the country to the Taliban. They need to ensure that any ongoing peace talks and negotiations, including what's happening in Moscow now and what's going to happen in Turkey in April, is going to be representative and inclusive, that the Afghan voices are truly going to be there, that women are truly going to be there, and that this process needs to be monitored by the international community. They need to see what's going on here. They need to see that the women are making huge sacrifices and our rights are at stake. And this is not good for the world. This is not good for anyone. Bringing women back inside their houses, depriving them of their right to education, lashing them and stoning them, which will happen in the case of the return of the Taliban, is not good for anyone. If we think that we are going to have a prosper Afghanistan when women are veiled and suppressed and killed again, that's not going to happen. It didn't happen in the past. It's not going to happen now. And that the Taliban need to be held accountable for everything that they did. We can't just clear our minds and pretend these people have done nothing to us, that they haven't killed our families, our friends, our colleagues, our children. That is not something we can forget and forgive. They need to be held accountable. And the world needs to hold them accountable.
So I'd be interested to hear maybe later what it means in terms of international community support to the fight against impunity or transitional justice. Let me turn to Shiva, because I see one of our participants is asking you, but I guess Susan as well, how does sanctions specifically affect the women's rights group and civil society in Iran?
Well, sanctions have weakened civil society for sure. I think the worst thing for activists in Iran or everywhere is being isolated and not having connection with other world. You know, it definitely hurts them. And the other thing, I think, when we talk about sanction, we should also talk about how it affects on people's life. People in Iran have been suffering a lot from sanction in last 4 years, and they have become poorer every day. And civil society activists are part of the society. They are also have become poorer every day, and when we talk about civil society activists in Iran, you should consider activism is not our job. We have different job. We should make money from different ways. So at first we should survive and then put some time for our activism side. In this situation, because of sanction and economic crisis in last 4 years, civil society have weakened because yeah, because of all this situation I explained to you, and you know, some of us has been collapsed, and the number of us became less and less. This lots of pressure, because of this lots of pressure, security repression and economic issues. So the other things is in this difficult situation, which is a kind of economic war, governments say, okay, we are in war. And in this war situation, no more activism, no freedom of speech, no protest, nothing. So it's all I can say about the effects of sanction on civil society.
Suzanne, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that Shiva said it beautifully. We've been saying the same thing for years, and I know it's because when I was in Iran in 2010, immediately after the Obama sanctions, which were very different, but at the time it was just shipping sanctions, immediately we couldn't have access to medicine. Sanctions haven't just hurt the Iranian society, they've also hurt the Afghan society, not just Afghans inside the country, but Afghans in Afghanistan who rely on money from Iran. So it really has a devastating impact. I talked to a colleague of mine in Iraq years ago, and she said, the war against Iraq was just the last measure. For all those years, the sanctions weakened Iraqi society. It was really the sanctions that did it. The war was the last measure. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. But you asked about the international community, what the international community can do. One thing the international community, and particularly the US government, but also European governments can do, is to have a principled approach to human rights across the region. It's not that, human rights is used as a weapon against the governments that you don't like, and then when it's the governments that you're friends with, that you can sell weapons to, etc., then you turn a blind eye. If you go to Afghanistan to save the women, then really you need to have a real commitment to that. I mean, Afghanistan, to me, is something that the West broke long before, even before the invasion of the Soviet Union. But if we look at it, Afghanistan at the time of the invasion of the Soviet Union, which was a fight between, it's a Cold War fight. Afghanistan was an innocent bystander. And it was the US that supported the Taliban. Why can the US bring the Taliban to the table and impose the Taliban on the people of Afghanistan, but not say anything to Pakistan and to Saudi Arabia and other governments that support Taliban, both ideologically, but also financially? This is a big part of the conversation that's missing in this peace process. It needs to be there. They designate the Iranian central bank as a terrorist bank, right? But they don't say anything to those governments that are supporting terrorists in this way. So I think that there's a double standard that really creates a lot of problems in the region. And we've been hearing more and more about it now because of the attention on Saudi Arabia from human rights groups and also the human rights sector in Saudi Arabia. But there needs to be a principled and a uniform approach, at least for the minimum, basic human rights standards of governments towards, towards the region, towards, and the UN system. And I think another thing that can happen is that the international community can truly support women human rights defenders and women in very practical ways to support their work. I was talking actually to somebody from Afghanistan recently. I mean, I keep bringing Afghanistan because I think Afghanistan is such a disaster. You know what I mean? It's such a crisis. I don't want to say it's such a crisis. So I don't want to keep bringing that up, but I feel like it's such a crisis. And she was saying that this is not the time for people to stop supporting the women's groups, that when you support, the smaller women groups need to be supported because that brings you some level of protection. It's the same thing in Egypt, for example. People are pulling out because Egypt is really difficult to support. But we have to be creative in the way that we support these groups, or Iran, for example, the isolation of the civil society, or Libya. I remember Libya just immediately after the Libyan revolution and how it, sort of descended into conflict, the international community's attention was turned away from Libya to other places. So Libya has never gotten the attention that it truly deserves and needs, and we need to support it. And I think the international women's movements have a big role to play here, is that they need to advocate with their own governments for a balanced and just policy towards this region that upholds women's rights and human rights.
I'm going to pick your brain on this in a moment. I think I want to give Razan the opportunity to comment on what should the international community do. In the context of Libya, that is a tricky question because you have so many different actors with so many different agendas. Europe being concerned with migration, others being concerned with expanding in the region. So what should the international community do? Over to you, Razan.
Thank you. Indeed, the international community intervened in Libya in the beginning to help the fall of the regime. After the fall of the regime, the support of the international community withdrew, leaving Libya to chaos. I remember now that in the declaration of the liberation of a country from Muammar Gaddafi's rule, Mustafa Abdel Jalil came out to break the first of women's rights, saying, now men have the right to marry 4 women. This was not present in Libya before that. From the beginning, when the international community left Libya, the rights of women were assaulted in a declared state. Men now have the right to marry 4. Taking into consideration, it's not allowed by the law. In the first Libyan government, in the presence of Abdel Jalil Aida, Sarah that was not wearing a veil, she was taken out, and even though there is no law to impose the veil on Libyan women, this was from the very beginning. Person pointed out the conference that I organized, it was very strong, but after that we were harassed. Now, after a number of wars, conflicts in Libya, many countries intervened with the conflicting sides. So the international community today came in late. Nevertheless, it's shyly, it's not strong enough, meaning the countries that supported the parties to the conflict in a report that was issued yesterday, the experts report, I think, Hasiba, maybe you have seen it. The experts report was very serious. The number of weapons that supported the parties to the conflict, despite the early surveillance of prohibiting weapon sales to Libya, we find that the EU was weak on this aspect. It didn't give a lot of attention to preventing weapons going into Libya. The international community, instead of intervening, gave signals to one party against another and allowed some countries to intervene in Libya, knowing that they don't have any geographic borders with Libya. We can understand that Egypt could be concerned with Egypt's security because it has borders with Libya. But the support and the intervention with the international community being blind to this led to killing, to the destruction of infrastructure, to the situation that we are in now. And the government in the West publicly asked for the assistance of Turkey, had an agreement with Turkey so that the Turks can come in as well as the mercenaries. The other party brought in the Sudanese, the Russians, and other mercenaries. Now Libya suffers from the presence of mercenary groups. The Syrian mercenaries are fundamentalists and extremists who came from Syria to Libya. What are they doing? The international community moved some time ago in the 5+5 CERT meeting. They gathered the factions for an agreement to unify the institution. However, until now, there is no real declaration that these mercenaries are going to get out of Libya. Russian security companies occupy a large part of the oil resources in the East. We now hear that the United States, after Joe Biden coming to power, there is hope because America in the beginning did not find the Libyan files to be important. Now we see greater attention, the strong official statements are coming to light, saying that the mercenaries should go back to their countries. What is the mechanism for that? There is no mechanism. We need a real mechanism to get these mercenaries, take them back to their countries. Also, the international community, what do we want from it? It has achieved part of the national reconciliation, but the way that the government was chosen, that we were hoping it would be based on shares. We want to put the country together rather than choose ministers that are affiliated with cities and specific tribes, specific entities. Until now, the new government, unfortunately, was based on giving shares. The United Nations put the framework on defining how the government is formed through electing 75 members in Geneva. I believe it's a good initial step, but the international community today can continue to be present and to observe the performance of the government with relation to getting the mercenaries out, as well as the corruption, not only as money, but also in terms of funding the armed militias who are mostly extreme. So they threaten peace in the country with relation to women, human rights defenders, women in general. I was talking to an activist friend, and they were talking to me in secret. They were witness, they don't know him well. He witnessed one of the members of the previous government. He gave millions to one of the militia groups. They pay them money to get protection. This is corruption that causes a threat to peace and security in Libya. The international community's role today to remain as an ally, a supporter to peace and the government, and so that the new government does not have its security pending on members of armed militias. This is a very complex process. The international community is able to build on it and to set the mechanisms that set the path of the security aspects in order to get rid of this chaos. Of course, I cannot talk today about East and West. We are supposed to, the government is supposed to be one government in the country. We hope that the international community continues as an observer and to also help with getting out these new groups and mercenary groups that are a burden on Libya and on peace.
I think what I hear all of you say is that you cannot separate women issues and women's rights and the defense of women human rights defenders from the broader context and for the fight for human rights. Shiva, I have a very concrete question. A number of Iranian women activists are in jail currently. What could or what should the international community do? And from the UN to maybe other women's groups who want to express solidarity.
I think I think they should follow Iranian activists and their demands and avoid doing anything that weakens them. International community also must take Iranian civil society serious. Most of the time they just repeat some names of political prisoners. I think it's not enough. They should make their government to keep open the way of negotiation with Iran, because I think when this way is open, when the doors are open, the government is in Iran is more responsive for their act, you know. It might be helpful for people and also civil society. When the doors are closed, they just do anything, everything they can, you know. They murdered people behind the door, they shut down internet, they executed more, arrest activists, and women activists in Iran also need to be heard. International women organization can be their voice. They must pay attention to them, while Iran government doesn't let them to have connection with other world. Women's movement around the world must stand in solidarity with their sister in Iran who are facing increased isolation, restriction, and the violence. I think the isolation of women working in contexts where civic space is limited or non-existent can only end through diligent advocacy and support of the International Women Organization.
That's helpful to know. I just want to ask the audience. I've sent a message on the chat function saying, please feel free to ask any question. I've only seen one. Just checking whether anyone has a question here. As we slowly wrapping up, maybe what we haven't conveyed enough, or maybe we have, is how astonishing women's groups are in the region. And in spite of the obstacles they face and that what we've heard about today, there are some great initiatives happening in the various countries. Shiva, you talked about Me Too movements in Iran. In Libya, we've seen women who were part of the political dialogue forum really being at the forefront and extremely active, and that is to be commended. I'm just wondering, are there lessons? Are there, what can, MENA is also about enhancing the cooperation South-South. What could we learn from each other? And I'm really asking the question to all of you. Suzanne, you seem ready to answer.
Sure, I'll answer because this is so a long time ago when I lived in Iran. We did a couple of visits to Turkey and then Morocco and other countries in the region. And it was astounding to me that even though the situation of women was so different, that there were so many commonalities. And it was really interesting for me to see the work that people in other countries were doing. And after, you know, I left Iran and sort of on the verge of those revolutions, I spent a lot of time in Egypt. I've learned a lot from the Egyptian women's movement. I have so much respect for them. I think they've done amazing work. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for us to, I mean, if nothing else, to see that other countries are going through similar issues is really helpful. And you don't always learn and do something immediate. You learn what they're doing, and sometimes it takes a little while before you can take that little bit of knowledge and transform it into some sort of action. Our 1 million signatures campaign was very different than the Moroccan model, but it was based on that model. In Iran right now, there's a group by the name of Harass Watch who's learned a lot of what they did, or they sort of were inspired, at least to some degree, from the work that Harass Map did in Egypt. Afghan women and Iranian women, I'm really excited and happy that through social media, they're now very much in touch and they're following each other. And you know, the Iranian women are so eager to share information about what's going on in Afghanistan. And so recently in Afghanistan, when the government said they're going to ban singing by girls over the age of 12, all these Afghan women started singing songs and posting it on the internet. And one of the songs they sang, which was so moving and touching for us, was the song from our 1 million signatures campaign, which is just, you know, so if nothing else, we inspire, but there's a lot of learning to be had. There are a lot of different groups in Iran. We're documenting the work of groups in Iran, in Afghanistan, in Lebanon, and Egypt around prevention of sexual harassment in the workplace. So they're using similar models, but some very different strategies. And we think not only can they learn from each other, but it's important for the international community to see the very innovative ways that women are doing work in these countries under difficult circumstances. In all of these countries, you don't have very strong syndicates. You don't have a business sector that's committed to preventing violence against women in the workforce. The government's not committed, and it's been women's groups that have done the work, the hard work, and they have incredible models of this. So I think both learning, solidarity, but then also forcing us to document the work that we've done is really critical, because we have done a lot of incredible work in the region, and we just very rarely do we have time to actually step back and sort of take it in and say, look, this is the great work that we've done. And I think it's important that we dedicate time to that. And of course, you know, Libya, I talked about how Libya was so similar to us. So I don't want to exclude Libya, but when I went to Libya, then I just thought, oh, this is a country that's so similar to Iran in its history of being isolated. And I'm sorry to see, but I think that Libyan women are also, like you said, are doing incredible work in terms of political participation and can be a model for the rest of the region, where women's movements stay away from the political process. So.
Yeah. Any other participants? Razan?
أيوة. أنا أريد
Yes.
أن
I want to start from what Susan has said to respond to how to learn from each other. I want to point out that Libyan women are strong to start with. They are courageous women. Originally, in their nature, even during the revolution, they played a notable and wide role that is known at the time of the fall of the regime. And the women's role continued. And or else, why do some of the groups, why do they think that women are a threat? Why do they deal with them with violence? Because they are courageous. In general, North Africa women are similar in strength and in courage. You mentioned, Hasiba, about women's presence. Most women in the Geneva dialogue are our friends, and I believe that Susan knows some of them, Zahra, Al and others. They are women who continue, although some of them had some threats. Some of them had to leave Libya for a while. Some of them, they don't go a lot to Libya. However, some of them still continue to be in Libya, but they continue the giving in order to grab our rights one way or another. Sometimes those who were in the dialogue, I know them personally, that they have received threats one way or another. There's maneuvering women sometimes in the absence of solutions to go out. They have to protect themselves. These are very specific experiences of women according to their, depending on their circumstances. When there is a major campaign, this was the reason that many women went out of Libya. We still are learning from other women through communication. We are in constant communication. In Saudi Arabia, when women are subject or in civil society organizations, also in Egypt, we are in contact with them. There are support campaigns. We still continue to communicate with each other continuously. The conferences, the exchange of experiences between us is the only means to give us more courage in order to continue. I would like to salute Libyan women, whether inside or outside, because they truly try every day to prove that they are capable of making a difference. Now they really make a difference. I would like also, in conclusion, to say that we have a demand that we started today to the Minister of Justice, Mrs. Halima. We started to write on the social media to give back the rights to Libyan women, not breaking the law allowing men to marry 4 women. We want her to give us this right, for this right to continue as it was in the past, to preserve women's gains rather than waste them. Thank you.
Highly symbolic.
I think there is a lot that us Afghan women can learn from the experiences in Libya and Iran, because Afghanistan is currently in a very unique situation. We are in that place where, unfortunately, the voices that are inside the country might get suppressed even more, and we will have to continue to do what we can. Those of us who are outside of the country, do what we can to make sure that we continue our fight, we continue raising our voices. If the day comes that where we have to start fighting for all of these rights that we gained in the past 16 years, again, all over with the Taliban, then that might be something we have to do. And we know with the increased targeted killings and how so many voices have already been pushed out of the country or killed. Those who were able to stay in the country are either silenced now, or if they raised their voices, they were killed. We know that there is a greater responsibility on those of us who are outside the country, who are safer, to continue the fight, to continue raising our voices. And there is a lot that we can learn from the women of Iran and the movements of women from Libya, and on how they have been doing this, even though if they were forced out of the country and pushed out.
I'm going to add my very small contribution to this is women in the region are strong. They showed it. They continue to show it. They're not deterred by all the obstacles they face. They're not deterred by imprisonment. However, sometimes their lives are at risk in their own country, and some have had to flee. And it is important that other countries are prepared and facilitate them leaving their country where their lives is at risk. And at a time where in Europe, but also a range of other countries, we are seeing the right to seek asylum shrinking as well, it is quite important to remember that asylum, that right to seek asylum, is a lifeline for some people. And this is something also that we need to fight for. As we are wrapping up, I just want to say a big thank you to our interpreter, Mandy. Mandy is to the issue, and this is why she's offering her skills in interpretation and translation to facilitate as well the participation of women from the region, international fora, and to make what they have to say available to international audiences. So thank you very much, Mandy, for being with us for 2 hours now. If we do not have any other comment, just a big thank you. Thank you for all our panelists. I think it's always humbling to be listening to you. I know a lot of challenges awaits for us, but I'm quite convinced that you will respond adequately. I wish you all a good afternoon or a good evening for some of you. And I'd like to thank once more MENA for this fantastic opportunity to discuss and to compare notes and experiences with women from the region. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Hasiba, for moderating this session so beautifully. And we know that a lot of people were interested in participating. They couldn't register. So we have taped this and we will post it on our website and probably on our social media accounts so people can share it if you think it's helpful. And I think certainly, you know, with all three countries, they're really important countries that the world is looking at right now. So the information shared here, I think, is very critical and helpful to people working on these, you know, on these issues and on these countries. So thank you to all the speakers as well.